You're gonna want to pay attention because this ain't a beginner's guide. My goal here today is to take a look beyond the surface level details to help you truly take your Qingyi gameplay to the next level. We're covering why manual mode can be crucial for Qingyi mains in particular, how Qingyi's unique combat flow can help you get the most out of her moveset in practical scenarios, and I'm gonna show you some advanced combo tech, which of course also means on top of everything else, I'm gonna teach you how to style a bit. Hi, hello, welcome, call me Casual, and if you hadn't noticed, I love cool combos, and Qingyi is somewhat surprisingly one of the best enablers of combo tech in the game. Interestingly, she's also one of the most beginner-friendly, yet likely one of the hardest to master. That's not all she brings to the table though, she's actually got a crazy amount of utility that makes her more than just an incredible stun unit. She's almost like a hybrid support character with everything she enables for you, and with the amount of flexibility she provides, she's gonna hold your value incredibly well regardless of your goals. She's very comfortably surpassed a lot of my expectations, cause it's kinda hard to fully grasp her true potential before you get her hands on her, but once you do, you'll understand how insane she can be. Qingyi isn't the easiest character in the world to play though, and it's going to take some practice to get the most out of her kit, but after spending some quality time together, I've got a couple of tips that should hopefully help connect the dots. So welcome to my advanced Qingyi guide, where I plan to help you take that next big leap to true mastery. And in service of that, we're not going to spend too much time on the basics today. Instead, we're really focusing on the complexity of Qingyi and how she plays off of Zenless Zone Zero's mechanics. And this is especially important for Qingyi because once you understand those complexities, you'll understand why it's actually kind of a good thing she's not the fastest stunner in the game and far from a direct replacement for Ambi. You'll also understand why manual mode might be a bit of an adjustment for some, but if you choose to ignore it with Qingyi in particular, I think you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. And of course, we're not just here to talk about juggling when it comes to the nuances of combat. I've got a couple of tips for Qingyi mains of all shapes and sizes, even a couple of team recommendations and warnings. So, without further ado, let's get into it, and if you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe for more gameplay-focused guides, because here at Hardcore Casual HQ, we're all about the love of the game, not necessarily just the grind or the gear. Let's kick things off with a little bit of groundwork. Again, this is more of an advanced guide, so we're not here to talk about every element of Qingyi's kit, just her most crucial building blocks. Namely, her Basic 3, Basic 4, EX Special, and of course her unique debuff attack string, which is a great place to start because it's more or less what your playstyle will often revolve around. Under her health bar, you'll notice Qingyi has a meter where she'll accumulate what's called voltage every time she deals electro damage. Once that reaches 75%, you can press and hold attack to initiate a 5-strike string, followed by a finisher which applies her subjugation debuff, which in turn boosts the damage an enemy receives while stunned. Each of the strikes that lands adds an extra stack of the debuff to your finisher, while the finisher applies 5 on its own, adding up to a total of 10 if all of the attacks connect. You can also release that held input at any time though to skip straight to the finisher, which actually functions as its own counterattack as well if you time the golden flash for immediately before you would have taken damage, which is a real lifesaver because this is a fairly long animation and it's hard to land every hit at all times. Which is why it's also fortunate that if you manage to time the finisher perfectly as a counterattack, it'll always apply the full 10 stacks so the initial attacks aren't always necessary. but they do each deal their own damage in days, so while they aren't needed for the debuff at all times, they can be useful for contributing to stunning the enemy quicker, which, interestingly enough, isn't always a good thing. You see, trash mobs and elites only need 10 stacks of the debuff for you to get the maximum results, but bosses need 20, so you'll have to charge that voltage meter twice and land at least 2 finishers. Certainly not the hardest thing in the world, but you want to avoid going into your stun DPS phase without max stacks, and if you're not paying attention, you can very easily wind up stunning the enemy before you get the chance. Especially if your Qingyi isn't being a bit greedy with her on field time. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but for now, I normally approach this by looking to land as many stacks of the debuff as soon as possible when dealing with bosses, which means almost always triggering that debuff finisher as soon as I cross that 75% threshold. Pushing to 100 doesn't take much extra time, and it does deal a decent amount of bonus damage in days if you do, but my number one priorities with Qingyi are applying the debuff and stunning the enemy in that order, because if you're managing your meter effectively and playing around that debuff, the stun will come naturally. Just be careful to keep track of how many stacks an enemy has and how close they are to stun, because you don't want to waste voltage unnecessarily, and you don't want to keep attacking an enemy for too long after you filled their days meter, which is another aspect of things we'll touch on later. But for now, just keep in mind this enhanced held basic attack is largely what you're playing around. So let's talk about Qingyi's best attacks for keeping that voltage meter full, starting with that BA3. In my opinion, this is one of the best basic attacks in the game, hands down. It's ridiculous. The AoE is massive, the electro anomaly buildup is it's substantial, alright. You can dodge mid-attack without dropping the combo, you can skip directly into this after a dodge counter or EX special, and maybe the craziest part is it's got its own built-in CC vacuum effect, which altogether gives Qingyi a truly insane amount of versatility, all wrapped up in one carpal tunnel-inducing package. I'm not kidding, part of the reason this video took so long is my hands are on fire. Maybe I'm just getting old, but this is just a lot of button mashing, I don't know. Anyway, like I said, one of the best attacks in the game. In no small part due to the nature of ZZZ's combat encounters, as the game appears to be leading into rather hectic fights with several enemies on all sides, and free grouping virtually on demand is kinda invaluable for dealing with entire waves of mobs all at once while conserving your other resources. Yet somehow it gets even better, because even when dealing with elites that aren't affected by the crowd control, it's still beyond useful, because the ability to steadily stack days on multiple enemies at once at such range is not so quietly super beneficial. Like, let's say you're fighting 2 enemies at once. It is one of ZZZ's favorite enemy patterns after all, and when you find yourself in that situation, the ability to potentially stun both at roughly the same time is kinda clutch. One of my biggest personal hiccups with dealing damage effectively during that stun DPS window is doing so while also avoiding interruptions from the second enemy on field doing its best to ruin my day. I mean, it's absolutely doable, and it can be really fun, actually, to adjust your attack strings on the fly while dodging, but let's be real, this does kind of kneecap your damage output. But if you can really effectively stun both enemies back to back, all of a sudden you've got free reign of the field, and it becomes infinitely easier to focus down the weaker target so you can turn your full attention to the real problem. And while Qingyi's entire kit more or less enables this playstyle, really BA3 is just in a league of its own. In my mind, this attack basically serves as home base. My game plan largely revolves around how do I get here as quickly and consistently as possible, because not only is this one of her best sources of voltage generation, but from BA3 you can really easily transition into any of her other attacks effectively on reaction. If you stop mashing, you'll get the enhanced BA4. If you hold the input, you'll go directly into the debuff string. If you press EX special, you'll smoothly transition into that as a combo ender, and you can safely dodge counter at any time without having to worry about interrupting your flow. But unfortunately, that is a bit of an outlier, because it's not always that easy to get back into BA3, especially from neutral, but that's where the EX special comes in. You see, after a parry, her debuff finisher, or BA4, which you'll be using often, Qingyi will reset back to neutral, and you'll have to land 2 standard attacks again before you can go back into her basic 3, which isn't ideal. Even more so because those first 2 attacks don't contribute to your voltage, so what I tend to do more often than not is save EX specials until after an attack that would force me out of BA3 without also giving me a way to get back into it. Or just generally from neutral or whenever I'm bringing Qingyi on field, even after a parry, so I can get back into BA3 as soon as possible. The EX special is just a great way to build momentum and lock an enemy down and prevent them from having a chance to push back in that gap between ending a combo and starting a fresh one. And given that you can control the duration, unlike a perfect dodge counter, you can adjust it to sidestep certain attacks and then safely shift right back into BA3. Or you can go for an enhanced finisher to apply debuff stacks, or maybe even follow it up with a dodge counter, because the thing about dodges is you only get 2 before they go on cooldown, so the extra iframes from the special can come in clutch for longer attach strings. This in particular can be super useful when fighting multiple enemies in order to avoid their attacks while keeping your pressure up. Situations where the precise timing for a dodge counter may be somewhat unclear when responding to several attacks at once, or, as I just mentioned, even in single target scenarios facing enemies with drawn out strings like big punchy rock guy over here. Not to mention how effectively the EX special can also stagger enemies, giving you breathing room to safely build meter, prep Qingyi's debuff, or charge BA3 long enough for an enhanced BA4. Qingyi's EX special is so great that I'm really enjoying using Steam Oven as my W engine actually, as opposed to a perhaps more impact focused option, because the extra energy regen makes it easier to always have special energy. So in lengthier fights or boss scenarios, Qingyi can very comfortably alternate between BA3, her counters, finishers, and her special without ever really having to use her standard physical basic attacks. Now, the last core element of Qingyi's moveset I want to touch on is her enhanced basic 4. After button mashing your controller into a fine place briefly, you'll see a flash, at which point you can release for BA4, which can be a uniquely useful attack. I mentioned you have 2 main priorities as Qingyi, debuffing and stunning the enemy. Well, this enhanced attack, EBA4, can be one of your best free tools for achieving the latter, especially when used effectively in combination with Qingyi's basic 3. It just gives you really fine control over precisely when the chain attack triggers. And I've actually got a great tip to help with that. It's one of the smallest yet quietly helpful quality of life changes you can make to your playstyle, and I really want to tell you now, but I swear it'll make more sense if we wait until the next section. But for now, outside of that, this BA4 also serves to launch weaker enemies airborne alongside Qingyi, and very helpfully provides Qingyi invincibility as long as she's airborne. Note this isn't for the entire duration of the animation, just while she's in the air, like most characters with similar attacks. However, unlike other characters, she also receives 40% damage and interruption resistance on startup. So while I know the timing for consistently dodging using attacks like this and others like Zhu Yuan's BA4 can be tricky and not ideal for everyone, even if that's you, I would absolutely lean into using this while using Qingyi, because if nothing else, even if your timing is off, it'll be much less punishing and you get really good value out of it. That being said, be careful of getting too over-reliant on the damage resistance. Especially in higher end content, enemies can still hit like a truck through it, even if you just get winged, but especially if you catch a full string. Which is why I really wouldn't rely on that resistance during BA3 or the debuff string, since they also get the 40%. But since they're such long animations and with the amount of multi-hit attacks in this game, it just feels like a really bad habit to get used to when there are better options in both circumstances like dodging or parrying. Think of that 40% DR as accident forgiveness more than anything. When it comes to the BA4 though, since it's so quick, you're not at risk long, and considering it's stuns, sometimes it's worth taking a small hit, cause, especially in a game like ZZZ, the best defense can be a constant offense, which Qingyi happens to excel at, in part thanks to manual mode. Now, recently I made a video covering manual mode very broadly, a primer, an introduction if you will, to help get people thinking about the potential behind the mechanic, potential that's only going to continue to grow as the game matures. But while a lot of people were absolutely picking up what I was putting down, there was also a certain degree of confusion from a surprising amount of people. Some even getting kinda weirdly hostile in the comments trying to claim manual mode is pointless, rah, 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 rah. Which I'm not gonna argue with people, it's just like a kinda hilarious self-report, not gonna lie, but some people are genuinely confused and just wondering what the deal is and why it's worth using manual mode. So I do want to provide a brief refresher, because when we get down to it, Qingyi is kind of the perfect example of some of the shortcomings of auto mode. Shortcomings that are only going to become increasingly apparent over time as the gap between players who learn to take advantage of all the game systems and players who just want to play more casually widens. And there's nothing wrong with playing casually. I would definitely argue I'm a very casual player on the build front. I've got almost 400 hours in the game and I've barely spent any time farming disk drives. Mine are all awful, and that's not even because I'm busy hoarding other resources. No, I just hate arbitrary time gating so much as a design decision that I kinda just tend to ignore most systems tied to it and just forget to even use my energy most days. But at least when it comes to the actual gameplay, personally I do find I have more fun when I gain more direct control over my character, when I'm moving with a higher level of intentionality behind my moment-to-moment gameplay. It's part of why games like DMC are so satisfying. Landing combos yourself is quite frankly just more rewarding than any QTE or cutscene in my humble opinion. It can be a big part of what keeps a lot of gaming experiences fresh long term, even somewhat simplistic ones like ZZZ, because all the additional options a feature like manual mode can enable for you will help you avoid getting stuck repeating the same stale combat loop over and over again until you inevitably get bored. Variety is the spice of life after all. Now, for those who may not be too familiar, it is a fairly new feature. In 1.1, ZZZ introduced the option for players to alternate between triggering chain attacks that lead to stun manually or automatically, the latter being the default the game launched with, and this change is kinda huge in general, but especially for Qingyi. Earlier, I described how smooth Qingyi can be to play thanks to how all of her moves can flow together, but auto mode can kinda throw a wrench in consistently achieving her number one priority, debuffing the enemy. As many of you are likely aware, in order to stun an enemy, you initiate a chain attack by using a heavy attack. These vary character to character, but generally speaking, they're things like your special, enhanced attacks, ultimates, basic finishers, the more impactful attacks in the character's moveset, you know? In Qingyi's case, her heavy attacks are her enhanced basic 4, but notably not the non-enhanced version caused by releasing the input too early, which will be important momentarily, while on the other hand, her special will always trigger chain attacks whether you use the EX version or not. And the same is true of her debuff finisher. That will always set off a chain attack regardless of whether or not you have the meter to actually apply the debuff. Aside from that, her own chain as well as her ultimate of course both trigger the chain attack sequence, but you likely won't be looking to use those for that purpose too often. But among other things, what you will be doing a lot of is dodge countering, which will trigger a chain attack, and therein lies one of the biggest hiccups auto mode causes. With attacks like your dodge counter and EX special both potentially triggering chain attacks, and considering they can both deal a substantial amount of days on their own, what can wind up happening very easily in the heat of battle is accidentally pushing the enemy over the edge and filling that days meter right before you have enough voltage to finish stacking your debuff. The enemy is not going to just stand there and let you wail on them in most circumstances, and especially with so many multi-target scenarios in game, which seems to be the direction things are headed on based on all our latest commissions, you are going to get interrupted frequently, and tools like your dodge counter and EX special are crucial for avoiding damage while maintaining your momentum. So if you use the right attack at just the wrong time, you'll trigger a chain attack, and if you haven't already finished applying your debuff, you're gonna be in a somewhat awkward position. An awkward position is easy to find yourself in with bosses in particular because again, they do require you to charge your voltage twice and land 2 enhanced finishers to max out your stats. Now, regardless of if you're using auto mode or manual mode, you can cancel out of your chain attack if it starts at the wrong time, but every time you do cancel it, you lose one of the attacks in the chain. So if a boss allows for 3 chain attacks normally, once you cancel, now you're only allowed 2. Elites go down to a single chain, and for weaker mobs, it removes your ability to initiate a chain attack entirely, and you'll go directly into the stun DPS phase. With auto mode, this is unavoidable unless you swap characters before the heavy attack lands, which is absolutely doable, and in some combat scenarios, it can make sense. Like, I used to do that occasionally to battery a couple extra flash freeze stacks with Ellen, but I think for fairly obvious reasons, this is less than ideal given the nature of how ZZZ's mechanics around attack strings, buffs, and how swapping characters impacts all that. There is a reason why people like me have been asking for manual mode since day one. As with manual mode, all of a sudden you have a variety of options when it comes to how to approach things. The way manual mode works, whenever you hold down the attack input while landing a heavy attack, you can prevent that heavy attack from triggering the chain. For example, in this circumstance where the counter attack would have triggered the chain, instead I chose to delay it and go directly into the enhanced finisher to apply the debuff and then allow that finisher to trigger the chain instead, so I could use my entire chain attack sequence without sacrificing anything by canceling prematurely. This is kinda important for Qingyi because, like I said, one of her 2 main goals is applying that debuff, and if you're not doing that consistently ahead of your chain attack sequence, you're kinda kneecapping some of her value. And none of this is to say that you can't use auto mode. If it's your preference, by all means, go for it. I love the fact that they made it so easy for people to alternate between auto and manual. I mean, I also get that a lot of people are having trouble adjusting to manual mode. I saw a lot of comments on my video from people who tried and then gave up on it because it was, it was just a little tricky. But really and truly, it won't be that hard to adjust as long as you're willing to commit and spend some time learning how to embrace the mechanic. And especially when it comes to a character like Qingyi, I do think if you happen to be ignoring manual mode outright, I do think you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice. Now, all that being said, let's talk about Qingyi's best attacks for stunning the enemy, because in general, manual mode or not, it can be easy to find yourself out of position with Qingyi and unable to stun the enemy at the right moment without leveraging the right heavy attack at the right time. Generally speaking, if you're looking to stun an enemy with Qingyi, you'll be doing so using her dodge counter, her special, EBA4, or the debuff finisher, so let me just TLDR this. Your EX special is a great option if you've just finished applying your debuff and want to very quickly trigger stun, especially if you have enough meter to extend the special. It can be a very reliable way to get you across that finish line without having to start an entirely fresh combo. The non-EX special works great too, but depending on your build and meter management, you can find yourself with energy to spare more often than not, so you won't have access to it at all times. And of course, as a much weaker attack, the non-EX special applies substantially less days, so unlike the EX version, I tend to only use the standard special to stun mainly when the days meter is already full or teetering like out on the very edge, like 99%. And I kind of view the debuff finisher through a similar lens. The full string with meter works great as a combo ender to push enemies into stun, even more so if your voltage reached 100% for the extra damage in days. But let's say you just used your debuff and the enemy is coming up just shy of stun. If your next attack or two would push them over the edge, you can very quickly use a neutral dodge attack and hold the input to trigger just the finisher even without the voltage meter for the debuff. And this can come in clutch as a very rapid way to stun when you're out of position instead of resetting your combo and working your way all the way back up to EBA4. And EBA4 just happens to be my personal favorite option for consistently triggering stun without using any resources and without waiting around for the enemy to attack for the sake of a dodge counter. Even more so because, as mentioned earlier, when paired together with BA3, an EBA4 can give you some of the most control over precisely when you trigger stun. A lot of enemies build days at slightly different rates depending on their level and resistances, so it can be tricky at times to reliably stun in the same way with the same timing in every circumstance. What BA3 and EBA4 allow you to do is carefully push the enemy right to the edge and then shove them over on demand. So you ready for that quality of life tip I mentioned earlier? It might take you by surprise, but maybe don't use your dodge counter or EX special if you find yourself close to stunning the enemy if you aren't absolutely sure that attack actually will. In my experience, what can happen far too often is you'll dodge counter to avoid a damage, only to find yourself coming up just shy of stun. So what do you do then? Ideally, I'm not looking to apply the debuff if I already have what you want to have at this stage, so I may want to save that meter. And you don't want to waste special energy either if the enemy is inches away from stun, so you don't want to use your other resources in general, right? In which case, your only real options are to swap characters, which can be finicky because often they won't be built around impact damage in the same way Qingyi is, so it can be hard to precisely tell whether or not their attack will trigger stun out of the gate. So the most reliable option is transitioning back into BA3 after a counterattack, charging BA4, and letting that trigger stun. Right? Wrong, actually, because dodge counters and EX specials can actually reset your EBA4, so even though you can go directly back into BA3 after landing one of those, if that happens to trigger stun right away, which again happens very often, you can find yourself just somewhat awkwardly waiting for EBA4 to charge up again before you can land it. And of course, the problem is charging EBA4 from scratch can take a second, and you don't want to be cutting too heavily into your stun timer while waiting on that. But what if you didn't have to worry about that kind of issue? You see, what I've found to be a very consistent approach, keep in mind you already have to be in BA3 for this to work, which, you often will be, you should be in most circumstances. But if I'm unsure if a counterattack or an EX special will actually stun the enemy when I want it to, instead of using either of those, I simply perfect dodge to avoid whatever damage and then take a beat. I pause just long enough for the dodge counter to reset, but not long enough for the overall combo to reset. Time it right, and you can go directly back into your BA3 while retaining your EBA4 charge. Whereas if you attack with a dodge counter or EX special and transition in BA3 afterwards, like I said, you'll lose it. Again, this is a small thing, but as soon as I figured this out and started incorporating it into my gameplay, it smoothed out a lot of Qingyi's rough edges in this department very nicely. But that's enough of the general tips for now. It's time to get a little bit more technical and talk about some truly advanced combo tech. Now, while we are going to talk about juggling to an extent, and y'all know I'm a big fan, of course, techniques like it are not always going to be the most practical option in every scenario. I kind of look at it just like hot swapping in Destiny, or rage and rune canceling in God of War, hell, flash stepping in S4 League. God, I miss it so much. I was such a menace. I bet I can still do all the weird Station 2 jump tech. Anyway, point is, none of this is absolutely necessary to play any of these games, but it can all be really, really fun. And once you get good at little things like this, you'll find small pieces of value from putting tech like it to work whenever the opportunity arises. And in the case of ZZZ's juggling specifically, it can at times be a really effective tool for immobilizing enemies or grouping and keeping them locked down while you finish your attack strings and shift focus to other targets on the field. Heck, it completely prevents some enemies from hyper armoring out of your attacks, so hey, there's value right there. And Qingyi happens to have one of the most versatile sets of launchers in the game in between her BA4 EX special and the debuff finisher, but there are a couple of weird tricks behind how they actually work in practice, making them a bit different from a lot of other options we discussed on the channel in the past. We'll start with the Enhanced Basic 4 as it's the easiest and most accessible option. It's actually rather beginner friendly. This attack happens in two parts, right? It's the uppercut followed by slamming the enemy back into the ground. But if you cancel out of the uppercut with a neutral dodge before the second half of the attack, you can very easily catch the enemy with Qingyi's basic attacks, or swap characters to do the same. Although the latter option can be a bit harder thanks to the fact that you have to really rapidly cancel and swap the character in with an attack that sustains a juggle to catch the enemy. Timing can be kind of tight. But overall, like I said, fairly easy all things kind of considered. What's a bit less so is the fancier version of this, where you swap characters for the sake of juggling after the second hit of the EBA4. You see the way ZZZ's systems work normally, if a character is slamming an enemy to the ground, that's where the enemy is going to wind up 100% of the time, and attacking in the middle of that animation won't really change anything. You'll just wind up hitting a grounded enemy as normal as they pick themselves up. However, if you land an attack specifically in the gap between when your character hits the enemy and sends them to the ground, but before the enemy actually touches the ground, you can keep them airborne. I'm reasonably confident this has to do with animation priority, which is why if you attack too early, at anything with like a ground slam will almost always supersede whatever else is going on. And this actually worked kind of the same way for both the BA4 as well as Qingyi's EX special, just with slightly different timing. It's a very small window between, the attack impacting the enemy and the enemy landing, but if you practice around aligning your attacks so that the enemy kind of like falls onto them, that can be a helpful way to keep it in mind. Once you get used to the timing, you should be able to land combos like these fairly consistently. Now, the really interesting attack here is the enhanced debuff string. It's kind of an outlier in the game, actually. It can both juggle and launch enemies in very unique ways. When it comes to juggling, all of the rushes will keep an enemy in the air, but they will drop just before the finisher, unless you swap another character in and use one of their attacks to fill that gap. This kind of thing is actually the basis for juggling in general in ZZZ, because it's all about filling gaps with precise attacks, because any pause in your offensive will see the enemy falling like a brick. For example, in that intro combo mad where I used Soldier 11's EX special, that only worked because I timed it to coincide with Lucy's summons doing their spin, which will juggle. Otherwise, the enemy would have fallen before Soldier's special came out because she has no way to fill that kind of gap herself. So, there's your combo theory TLDR, but back to Qingyi. The finisher from the debuff string is what actually launches the enemy, and of course, you may have noticed that unlike other launchers, instead of sending the enemy airborne, this is much more of a horizontal thrust, so you kind of can't approach it the same way. What you're looking to do here is intercept the enemy in that brief window right after the finisher lands, but before they hit the ground, and from there you can go into a juggle sequence quite comfortably. Personally, I find the most consistent way to do this is by matching your timing so the attack lands immediately after the finisher, like right after the enemy gets tossed. There's a little bit of leeway, but a lot of characters have trouble with this kind of thing if the enemy gets too close to the ground, so I found the most consistent approach is just to, land that juggling attack as soon as possible. Now, this does happen fairly quickly, but it is a fairly generous window as long as you're prepped and ready to take full advantage of it, in my opinion. Once an enemy is airborne, though, Qingyi is kind of similar to Zhu Yuan in the sense that all of her normals juggle incredibly effectively, and her BA3 is actually one of the easiest ways to keep multiple enemies in the air in the game, which in general is always going to be kind of difficult based on the way targeting works in ZZZ. I mean, it's heavily biased towards single enemies, so you're going to struggle to keep multiple enemies airborne and actually maintain any kind of combo. If you are looking for combos in general, though, if you're looking to style, I think Qingyi is just a fantastic choice, and in general gameplay, she's even better, but probably not for everyone out of the gate. In fact, if you're free to play, I kind of recommend skipping her for now and grabbing her on the rerun. She's incredible, and the vast array of utility benefits she provides are gonna make her a very valuable character for a long time. I know she's likely finding a permanent home on one of my teams, but she is an electro stunner, and Ambi already fits that role quite nicely. So, quite frankly, Qingyi is just one of the least necessary pulls I think we've seen so far. Especially if you're more interested in vertical as opposed to horizontal account progression, right? Plus, it's very worth keeping in mind that, in my opinion, she performs best on teams like Zhu and Nicole, not so much with characters like Ellen and Sokaku. Qingyi is somewhat of a selfish on-field unit since she needs to battery her voltage meter and potentially land multiple debuff finishers, and when I've used her in conjunction with characters like Ellen and Sokaku who also want a bit of on-field time to battery their own resources, it can occasionally be a bit awkward juggling all of that at the same time, so all of their individual buffs and whatnot are where they need to be ahead of that stun DPS phase. Zhu and Nicole are a perfect pairing though, since they can very comfortably be played off-field, and even if you need to generate some ammo for Zhu, that happens relatively quickly and can be done without pushing the enemy's daze meter too far. Now, this isn't to say Qingyi can't work with characters like Ellen, she absolutely can, but I would keep in mind how an alternative like Ambi might be a more comfortable pick in a comp like that, since without her own unique resources to manage, she's a much more flexible with her field time. But all that being said, I love what Qingyi's design implies about the future of ZZZ. She's a really interesting, almost hybrid unit that doesn't directly power creep any of the other stunners in my opinion, while not sacrificing her own unique strengths. Instead, it very much feels like so far the dev team is balancing around these characters having their own specialized roles and playstyles in their niche, and I'd love to see that continue. It could put ZZZ in a very comfortable place to be a game where you're truly playing whoever feels best to you based on what they can do for your team instead of having to worry as much about who has the highest multipliers or whatever. But, if you know me, min-maxing is never top of mind anyway. So, thanks for joining me today for this more in-depth look at Qingyi. And there are more combo guides coming very soon. Knock on wood, you'll be seeing Jane and Seth coverage if the Gacha Gods smile upon me next week, but it's not gonna be all combo guides all the time here. I really like making that more general manual mode video, so expect more in that vein, and more general discussions about the state of the game overall. I apologize for this video coming out so late. I've been a bit under the weather. You can probably hear it in my voice. I apologize for that too. But outside of that, this is a new channel and I've just got a lot of other responsibilities in life at the moment. But, if you would like to see me in a position where I can make this more of a priority and you can get more videos more often, maybe subscribe and help me get there. Regardless, I know a lot of people tend to ignore guides like this after the initial gold rush, which is part of why early access can be so important to some. But I don't know. Personally, I'm always going to want to spend a lot of time with a character, putting them through their paces, really getting to know them before making a video like this, so I'm probably always going to be a bit behind the curve, and you know what, I'm cool with that, to be honest. If I sacrifice a couple of views for the sake of making a video I'm happier with, and that's a trade-off I'll take every day of the week and twice on Sunday. So again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to join me here. I'm immensely grateful for all the love and support from the community, and I've started meeting other creators in the space as well, and been really blown away by how welcoming and chill everyone has been. If you like what you see, please do consider leaving a like and joining the crew, embracing that filthy casual lifestyle. Forget about the min-maxing and the spreadsheets and embrace the gameplay-focused fun. It's certainly not the only way to enjoy yourself in games like these, but at least in my opinion, it can absolutely be one of the best ones. And in that spirit, I'm never here to dictate how you play. You do you. Play how you want to. My main goal here is always just to share potential avenues to help you find your own pathway to fun, so by all means, feel free to take from this video as every video what you want and leave what you don't. Cheers, lads and ladies, and thanks again for watching. Let me know down below what your favorite combo or piece of Qingyi tech is, because I always love hearing about everything the community has uncovered, and hopefully I'll see you back here sometime very soon.